Welcome to 10-Minute Murder, brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, the host, and thank you for joining today. Sorry about that. I removed the rug from under the desk where I normally do this podcast, and it's just my rolling chair on a hardwood floor, and I bumped the desk a little bit, and it pushed me halfway across the room, away from the microphone. I'm back now, and holding on for dear life. Hey, if you are a new listener to 10-Minute Murder, this is the first time you're listening, I'm super excited that you're here. Make sure you hit subscribe right now. Wherever you're listening to this podcast, hit subscribe, and that's going to do a couple of things. First, it's going to make sure that you can automatically come back and listen to more episodes in the future. You don't have to go searching for it every time. And it makes you to where you don't have to manually download the episodes every time. It's going to download it for you so that you can listen to 10-Minute Murder and not miss anything. If you're an OG listener, I love you, and I'm glad that you're back. Make sure you share this podcast with any friends and family that you think could be into brief stories of true crime like this podcast. Before we get going with your story today, this is a quick disclaimer. If in the background you hear something that might sound like a washing machine or a dryer, that's exactly what it is. The 10-Minute Murder studio where I record all of this is right across the hall from my laundry room. And I'm having to multitask today because I've been so consumed with trying to catch up on reading all of the story suggestions that you guys are sending me. Joe at 10minutemurder.com, by the way. That's where you can send it. I've been trying to catch up on reading all of those, and I'm multitasking today, doing laundry and 10-Minute Murder at the same time. So if you hear that, pretend like you didn't. All right, now to the story today. Not guilty by reason of insanity is one of true crime's most controversial defenses. We see killers who pretend to be insane, thinking that they can game the system. They can con the courtroom into giving them a lighter sentence. But on the other side of the spectrum, there are killers who genuinely are overtaken by mental illness and not in their right mind. How do we tell if someone is truly insane? And can an insane person still be guilty of committing an evil crime? In the case of Andre Thomas, it's still up for debate. Mental illness was a part of Andre Thomas's life since before he hit puberty. For the first 10 years of his childhood, Andre was a gifted, intelligent child who thrived despite a difficult upbringing, raised in poverty by a depressed, alcoholic mother in a dysfunctional family. He was smart, he made friends. It seemed like he was going to escape the unfortunate circumstances that he'd been raised in. In 1993, when Andre was about 10 years old, things started to change. His classmates remember Andre insisting that he was a character from the game Mortal Kombat and telling his friends that he had hallucinations where he could hear angels and demons talking to each other. Shortly after this, Andre started abusing drugs and alcohol to try to quiet the voices in his head, but it didn't help. It only sent him into legal trouble and a string of arrests throughout his early teens, as well as multiple failed suicide attempts. Even though during one of his stays in juvenile detention, he revealed that he was suicidal, nobody offered Andre any support for his mental health. Adding to Andre's problems of hallucinations, arrests, and drug abuse, his girlfriend, Laura Boren, got pregnant. Andre dropped out of high school to help Laura take care of the baby, who they named Andre Jr. At the time, Andre was only in the 9th grade. The couple actually managed to stay together until Andre turned 18, and he married her immediately. However, their marriage was shockingly short-lived. They got kicked out of Andre's mother's house, where they had been living together, and decided to separate less than 4 months later. Soon, Laura got a new boyfriend. She moved in with him instead and had a second child 2 years later. Losing Laura and his child, who were some of the only sources of stability in Andre's life, put his mental state into a pressure cooker. His hallucinations and his delusions got much more intense, and he became obsessed with the idea of the apocalypse after reading the Bible's book of Revelation. It was all he could think about. He couldn't hold down a job, couldn't pay the bills, and he wasn't allowed to see his son often due to his spiraling mental health. At one point, he was accused of stabbing his brother during an argument, but was not convicted. Over time, his biblical obsession spiraled into a firm belief that Laura was Jezebel, one of the Bible's most evil women, while Andre Jr. was, in fact, the Antichrist. During this period, Andre's list of addictions received a new addition, corticosteroid, an antihistamine medication that can cause euphoria when taken in large doses. A concerned friend of Andre's took him to a mental health clinic, and Andre told the staff there that if he couldn't speak to someone that day, he would go outside and jump in front of a bus. Alarmed, the staff told Andre that he needed to go to the emergency room, but even though an emergency detention order was prepared by a judge, Andre didn't follow through. 3 weeks later, Andre did arrive in the emergency room, but under very different circumstances. After stabbing himself in the chest, he arrived at the emergency room while announcing that he was trying to, quote, cross over into heaven. The stab wound wasn't life-threatening, so one of the doctors began to organize for Andre to be committed to a psychiatric hospital. Meanwhile, Andre walked out of the emergency room and took himself home. It was the 27th of March, 2004, when Laura Boren's apartment door was violently kicked open by Andre. Inside, Lauren was home alone with Andre Jr., who was now 4 years old, and her 1-year-old daughter. Andre stabbed Laura to death in a quick outburst of violence and then cut her chest open, intending to cut out her heart. However, his knowledge of anatomy failed him, and he accidentally took out part of her lung instead. After Laura was dead, Andre went after the children. He killed his own son, as well as Laura's daughter, by stabbing both of them with different knives, and then removed their hearts. With the 3 inhabitants of the apartment dead, Andre turned the knife on himself, and then lay down on the floor next to Laura's body to wait for death. The seconds ticked by, turning into minutes, and Andre still wasn't dying. When he realized that his wounds were not actually fatal, he left Laura's apartment, taking the children's hearts and the section of Laura's lung with him. He threw the organs in the garbage once he got home, then called Laura's parents. They didn't pick up, so he left them a voicemail asking for help, saying that he didn't know what was going on and that he believed he was in hell. With the 3 self-inflicted stab wounds in his chest still bleeding, Andre made his way to the police department, where he turned himself in. He made it clear to the officers that he needed to kill Laura and her kids because they were possessed by demons. In fact, God had asked him to commit the murders. He also explained that he'd used a different knife for each of the victims. If their blood mixed together, it might allow the demons to survive. With this explanation out of the way, Andre was admitted to the hospital for surgical treatment of his chest wounds before being sent to jail. While waiting for his trial, Andre had a lot of spare time in jail. He returned to one of his only comforts in life, reading the Bible. There were 2 passages that really stuck with him. Mark 9:47, which states, "And if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out." And Matthew 5:29, which says, "If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out." To Andre, the message was very clear. 5 days after committing the murders, Andre Thomas removed his right eye himself, using nothing but his bare hands. Understandably, this course of action required a psychological evaluation of Andre before he was allowed to stand trial, and he was quickly diagnosed with schizophrenia and ruled incompetent to go on trial. However, after Andre spent several months in the hospital, his psychiatrist wrote to the courts and told them something different. He believed that Andre was only suffering from drug-induced psychosis, not schizophrenia. The psychiatrist also insisted that he believed Andre was putting on the symptoms of his mental illness to avoid standing trial, to the point where he had knowingly removed his own eye. With this evaluation, Andre's trial for murder began. The trial centered around debates of Andre's sanity and whether his hallucinations were drug-induced, which would leave him unable to use an insanity defense, or due to actual mental illness. Racist undertones were also present in the courtroom, with an all-white jury disapproving of Andre, who was black, having a child with a white woman. The trial concluded, Andre Thomas was sentenced to death for capital murder. While on death row in Texas, Andre kept having auditory hallucinations, as well as repeatedly seeing miniature demons who materialized through the walls of a cell and played songs from the band Queen. Once again, Andre attempted suicide by trying to slit his own throat, but survived. 3 months after his suicide attempt, his conviction was upheld by the court, with Judge Kathy Cochran commenting on the verdict saying, "This is a sad case. Applicant is clearly crazy, but he is also sane under Texas law. In December 2008, Andre Thomas, who was deemed sane by the state of Texas, removed his remaining eye by hand and proceeded to eat it out of concern that the government might be able to use his eye to read his thoughts. When this resulted in Andre being moved to a unit for mentally ill prisoners, his attorney remarked that this meant he was finally able to get the mental health support that he needed. Despite repeated attempts at appeals, Andre remains on death row today. His execution was scheduled to take place on April 5, 2023, but less than 1 month beforehand, it was delayed. The question of whether Andre is legally insane and whether he knowingly committed his crimes is yet to be answered.